I first met our guest speaker, Dr. Faulkner, a couple years ago at a Creation Research Society open house down in Glendale when they were doing that, and we got to chatting. And at the time, I mentioned to him that I host meetings in Payson and Sholo, and he says, "Oh yeah, I know about Sholo. I go through there every year on my way up to this camp, which he'll be going off to this next weekend." And I said, "Well, maybe sometime you think I could snag you to do a presentation?" And he said, "Yeah, I think we could work that out." So 2 years ago, I was able to catch him and give him a talk in Sholo. This year, we were able to get him in a couple extra days early. He gave a talk last night down in Chandler. He's speaking here this evening. Tomorrow evening, he'll be in Sholo. And then from there, he whisks his way off to Apache County, and he'll be doing some stuff up there. And I won't go into all the details about conversations we've had and like that, but I'll have to give you this warning. If you should ever have this guy lead you on a hike, good shoes, good hydration, you know, energy bars, stuff like that, because you're going to be going like the Energizer Bunny. And but you know, it's all great. He took us on a hike this last September. We visited Kentucky, and we had just had a delightful time in his company and having him show us around a bunch of natural arches and bridges in Kentucky there. And so that's kind of his. When he's not talking about the stars, he's talking about the rocks. And he's got a lot of good things to share with us this evening. So would you please make welcome Dr. Danny Faulkner.
Good evening, folks. Let's try that again. Good evening. Good evening. Very good. I'm delighted to be here. I've often thought that if I lived in I love Arizona. It's a wonderful thing, a lot of neat things here. But Phoenix is a bit hot and Flagstaff's a bit cool. I thought if I were to live in Arizona, I'd want to be at about 5,000 feet. In Payson, you picked it perfectly, right? You're right at 5,000 feet. So I've not been here in the winter. I have to see what it's like, but the summers are wonderful here. So I've always enjoyed driving through Payson and now spending a little time in Payson. You may wonder why it's a little dim in here. I'm an astronomer. I like the dark, so deal with it. And many times when I'm in a meeting like this myself, I have a tendency to get comfortable and take my shoes off. I strongly recommend you do not do that. It's not safe. Enough said. So again, I'm delighted to be here. I'm going to be showing you some pictures and to get back to the book that he talked about. But I call it the wonder of creation. We do live in a wonderful world. I may be biased, but I think astronomy is really where it's at. And I think one of the things that really hooked me in astronomy as a youngster, well, people ask me, how did I get interested in astronomy? Well, and when was it? Well, I don't remember a time I was not fascinated with the stars. And that, I remember where we lived when we moved away shortly after I turned 5 years old. This would have been probably, could have been when I was 4. I doubt it was when I was 3. I remember sitting on the front stoop of the house and looking up as it got dark and seeing the stars, and I thought, boy, that's really fantastic stuff. And my entire growing up years, I went through my dinosaur phase and things like this, but I never forgot the stars. And as a sophomore in high school, I discovered 3 things. Number one, you could actually make a living doing astronomy. I thought, well, that's cool. By the way, I'd never given any thought what I would do with my life up to that point. And the second thing is I realized that I had the ability to do that. And third, I realized that that was my calling in life, to be an astronomer for God's glory. And it's not like I work for a living. So it's one of those wonderful things. And I think the wonder and beauty you encounter in astronomy is remarkable. And my life, first if you will, has always been Psalm 19:1, the heavens declare the glory of God and the firmament showeth his handiwork. I graduated went my last year of high school to a Christian school. It was kind of a new movement back then. I graduated from there, and they wanted in the yearbook a life verse for everybody. People were thinking Philippians 4:13, things like this, and I had Psalm 19:1, and I'm sure a lot of classmates and some of the staff and faculty wondered, what's that all? What kind of life verse is that, you know? But I think as they found out later on what my life path was, if they look back on the yearbook, they said, well, that made perfect sense for him because he was going to become an astronomer. Well, what better way to share that wonder and beauty than with astrophotography? And you may wonder, well, what is astrophotography? You may have to look that up if you saw the title for tonight. Well, basically, it's a photography of stars and other celestial objects, and there are several ways you can do this. One of them is to simply take a camera, put it on a tripod, and take pictures of the night sky. And I've done a lot of that over the last. I started doing this about 8 years ago, maybe. I'd never done it before, and I just never bothered doing it. And my motivation originally was to collect some images that I could use in some of my many writings on the web or the books that I use to illustrate things. I didn't want to go out there and try to find something in the public domain or to try to find, work through copyright issues and so forth. I wanted to collect those, and I soon found a couple of amateur astronomers that take photographs too, and support the ministry. They love Answers in Genesis, and so I said, can you give me some photos? And boy, did they give me some photos, and incredible stuff. And the other thing you can do is you can take the camera lens off the camera, get a special attachment, and you can attach it to the telescope and use the telescope as a camera lens. It's got a bigger lens, it's got a lot more light it can collect. That has some other issues like a drive on it and that kind of stuff to make it work. But I've kind of mixed it up and done both of those. I used to wonder why photographers had so many cameras. You know, why not one? I have 4 now, so I'm thinking about a couple more too. So it's one of those things. It's habit forming as it can be, and so I'll share with you some of those photographs tonight and some of the work I've been doing over the last few years and what I've done with it. This very first one, and can you turn the lights off just for a minute back there? Wait till this woman has her seat so she can find it, and then if you can turn more of the lights off, maybe the bank on the right side would be helpful, because it'll show up better if you do. Oh, that's great. Okay, I took this a few years ago at Grandview Camp, where I'm going this weekend, and it's 8,300 feet, and it's in Arizona, so it's dry. You know, moisture in the air can scatter starlight and make it dimmer and make the sky brighter. You don't have an issue like that there in Arizona. This is a half-hour exposure. I put the camera on the widest setting I had on a standard camera lens, and I had ISO 100, and I took a 30-minute exposure. And when you do that, you'll see the stars all going in a circular pattern, and near the middle there's a star. Anybody know what that star is? North Star or Polaris, the same, 2 words for the same names for the same star. It actually is making an arc too. It's not exactly at the center. It's about 3/4 of a degree from the center, but that's okay. It's close enough. And the arcs get bigger as you go farther out. That smear across the top, that's the Milky Way being spread out. So I took that photograph, and I'm just stunned. I thought it was a wonderful photograph. And I looked at it a number of times over the next month after I took it. And finally, one day, I happened to notice there's this red glow down here. And there's a green glow above it. Didn't notice that. And I thought, oh, Aurora Borealis. Now, I couldn't see it that night, but over 30 minutes, the camera sure could pick it up. So it's my first Aurora photograph, even though it wasn't supposed to be that. And I've done this other places and other times. You may think working for Ken Ham at Answers in Genesis is just a bowl full of cherries, but I'm here to tell you that there's an unseemly underside to the ministry. There can be some pretty tough things that happen to you there, and the working conditions can be very rough. I'll give you an example of that. One of the things they make me do every year is take a week-long raft trip in Grand Canyon. The inhumanity. We advertise that trip as geology by day and astronomy by night, and that means that I'm working like 18 hours a day. And I tell people on the trip, don't be fooled by the smile on my face. It's just put on. I'm not happy. I can't get any sympathy with this crowd. I'm working like a dog, and I can't wait to go back home, go to work next week so I can get some sleep. So anyway, that's one of the things I do. So this next one is one of the pictures I took, another half-hour exposure while in Grand Canyon. And you can see the rocks there and everything. And this one had a little more brightness to the sky. I think the moon was out a little bit that night. But I think it's a little better. Also, to tell you the truth, the stars look better at 8,300 feet. And it took me a few months to figure that out. The first raft trip I went on, it wasn't quite as dark as I thought it would be, and the stars weren't quite as bright. Don't get me wrong, it was good, really great actually, but I finally figured it out. When you're down in the canyon, you've got a mile more air between you and the stars, and that really blocks out some light, believe it or not, but the average person would never notice that. And then after I did this for a little while, I got into time-lapse photography. I'll take hundreds of photographs, then I'll put them into a time-lapse movie, and one of my first attempts is right here. This was over my house. Right here, this is a peek of my house over the front door. Right there's Polaris. You can see up here we have the Big Dipper. The stars point here to the North Star. Here's the Little Dipper, 1, 2, 3 stars in the handle, 4 stars in the bowl. Everybody got that? So this is I was just experimenting with this to see how it would work. And I took the pictures, didn't know what I was going to do with it. I got this thing called Time-Lapse Creator where I put the pictures in and it makes this time-lapse video for me. So in a matter of seconds, you're going to see an hour's worth of time. And here we go. You'll notice it's rotating counterclockwise roughly around Polaris. So instead of smearing out, you've got those stars all spinning around in a counterclockwise direction. Now, the North Star seems to stay fixed because the rotation axis of the Earth is pointing almost directly at the North Star. But if we turn around and look southward, as I did here, this is one of my early attempts for time-lapse in Grand Canyon. This was taken, I think, the first night of the trip in Marble Canyon. I'm looking southward, and you're going to see the stars moving in a clockwise rotation because I turned around and looked the other way. The stars are moving east to west the whole time. So here's a view of that. The flashes of light in the foreground are for my campers. That bright star is Jupiter. Then comes the Milky Way sliding through. And it's just really amazing, isn't it, like that? Now, each one of my pictures that I take, there are 13-second exposures typically at ISO 6400. And each one is like 13 meg. And so when I make a time-lapse video, you lose a lot of resolution on that. I'll show you one of the still frames from that. That was one of the still frames that went into it. So the still frames are actually better than the movie. And now you'll notice that rotation was clockwise, but the center of rotation was well below the frame there. In fact, it's below the Earth's surface by about 35 degrees. So in order to see that, you need to go to the southern hemisphere. If you go to the southern hemisphere, you can see the center of rotation in the stars down there, but then the North Star won't be visible. It'll be below the horizon because you only see half the sky at a time. So I was in South Africa a few years ago, and I made this attempt from Kruger National Park. You ever heard of Kruger National Park? It's world famous. Anybody been there? It's world famous. It's when I first heard of Kruger, and for many years I thought it was like our national parks. You know what the national parks here, like Grand Canyon, you've been there many times, I'm sure. You drive, you get out and look at stuff, you get back in the car and you drive, you get out and look at stuff, get back in the car and drive and look at stuff. You don't do that in Kruger. You stay in your cars. There's a good reason for that. If you get out of the car, there could be a lion in the brush you didn't see. They're kind of tawny colored and camouflaged. In fact, people have died there for that reason. So you stay in your cars. And when I got home, I looked it up. Kruger is big. It's huge. It has the same land area as New Jersey, but it's not nearly as dangerous. So I took this. We spent a day going through the park, and then we camped. You have to make your reservations. You have these fortress almost. It's a big high fence around it, double gate and everything. You got to get there before 6 p.m. when they close the gate, and you can't leave until 6 a.m. You're trapped. And we got there by the water. I could hear the hyenas off in the distance, and I could, pretty close actually, and I could hear just over the fence, over the river, we could hear the hippos at night. It was really cool. And I set this thing up in a parking lot, and it was a bright moon, unfortunately, that night, but I'm going to show you a time-lapse video. Before I do that, there is the Milky Way right here, the southern part of the Milky Way. We don't see that at all. This is the Coalsack Nebula, a very dark thing. You can watch that dark spot rise. This is the Large Magellanic Cloud, and this is a Small Magellanic Cloud. They're small satellite galaxies that orbit around our Milky Way galaxy. You can't see those from up here because they're southern. God put all the good stuff down there, as it turns out. You've heard of the Southern Cross? It's right here. That's the Southern Cross. And the center of rotation is going to be about right here. There's no South Star. Not like, so we got one thing they don't have. We have a North Star, but they don't have a South Star. And I'm going to show you this rotation. You'll see it goes clockwise, and it goes for several hours. And again, I apologize for the background of the thing being kind of bright because there was a more than half-lit moon. It kind of wipes things out. If it would have been a dark night, it would have been incredible. And then there is the, also cars are turning around in this parking lot. So you'll see a few cars, taillights and stuff on the trees. So here we go. This is going to go over several hours rotation, and notice it's going clockwise, as I said. And there is no South Star. And then towards the end, some clouds rolled in, and I had to stop what I was doing. And when I look at this, I see the Milky Way contains a couple of 100 billion stars. And we think we're not sure the count of how many galaxies there are, but it's probably a couple 100 billion. I'll leave it up to you to figure out how many stars there are in the universe. Now, that's a staggering number. I mean, it's even bigger than a national debt, if you can believe that. And when I think about stuff like this, I think of Psalm 147:4. He telleth the number of stars, he calleth them all by their names. Not only does he count them, but he names every one of them. And that's amazing because we've got about 150, 200 stars that have proper names. Beyond that, we have catalog numbers, but not names for all of these stars. And that's remarkable to me. But you know what? God can do that because God made them. It'd be kind of weird if he made them and I don't know how many stars there are, he'd say. No, he'd have to know, wouldn't he? And here's
the power for their existence.
What's that?
He supplies
The power for the, yes.
their existence.
Moment by moment, according to Colossians 1, 16, 17, and Hebrews 1, 3, he upholds the creation by the power of his word. And I'm thoroughly convinced that if he stopped doing that, the world would cease to exist. How it would do that, I don't know, but it would not, because he is sustaining it moment by moment. This is a still shot I took a little later in the night. It was cloudy, so I went to bed. I got back up a few hours later, and all those hyenas woke me up, I think. And then I took this, and I could see a few more clouds. But this is now the center of the Milky Way right here, a big bulge right there, center of the Milky Way above the ground, and you can it barely gets above the horizon here in the northern hemisphere. Here's a photo I took. A still photo I took, a 13-second exposure of the Milky Way, again from Grandview Camp, that 8,300 marvelous place. This is the bulge right here, part of it, and then going out this way it thins out. And you can actually see it thicken up there, but if you're in the southern hemisphere, that thickening part is over your head. Here's another still frame I took in one of the trips in Grand Canyon. There's the Milky Way, partly blocked by the... problem with the Grand Canyon is not only you're a mile deeper and more scattering from the atmosphere, but you got all these stupid rocks that get in the way. But a few years ago, Mars was at opposition, and this is Mars showing up right there, that kind of a yellowish-orange star there. Pretty impressive stuff. And again, reflecting on these things, I think of Isaiah 40:26, lift up your eyes on high, and behold, who hath created these things that bringeth out their host by number? He calleth them all by names, by their greatness of his might, for that he is strong in power, not one faileth. Again, a nice assurance and promise there that he gives to us. You know, when we look at the creation account in Genesis 1, we learn on the fourth day. By the way, you've heard of the band called Third Day? I'm a real hardcore creationist. How can you tell? Well, when I first heard of that band about 20 years ago, my response was, what, they groove out on dry land and plants? I'm probably the only person on the planet who didn't understand them. Somebody had to explain that to me. I'm kind of embarrassed to admit that, but I am a hardcore creationist. So if I had a band, what would I call it? Fourth Day, right? Because that's the best day of the creation week, right? Because he made the heavenly bodies that day. But according to Genesis 1:16, and God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day. And he's talking there, of course, about the sun. And here's a photograph I took of the sun a few years ago. I started doing this about eight years ago, maybe. It was during sunspot maximum. And I spent 2 years spinning my wheels. I would try to take photographs of the sun. And I would see these beautiful sunspots, big ones like this. And you can see the dark inner portion called the umbra, the grayish outer portion called the penumbra, a lot of structure. And so I would look through the telescope, and I would then adjust my ISO setting and my exposure time to match the brightness and the color I was seeing. And every time I did that, I'd download the photos, and they just didn't look like that. You lost all structure, kind of washed out. It was just really bad. I spent 2 years wondering what I was doing wrong, and finally I figured it out. The camera and the eye don't work the same way. They've got a lens that forms an image, both of them do, and they both have a photosensitive surface. In the case of the eyeball, though, it's the retina, and the retina has living tissues in there called cones and rods. Cones are color sensitive, rods are black and white. The black and white are very sensitive to light. Cones, it takes a lot of light to get those tweaked. If you look around right now in this dim room, there are probably a lot of things you cannot identify the colors of because you're not getting enough light to tweak those cones. And that's a problem in astronomy because you don't see a lot of colors because of that. Now, there's something else going on, though. The photograph, the camera responds linearly to light, and that means if you increase the brightness by a factor of 2, it will respond by a factor of 2. If you increase it by a factor of 10, it will increase by a factor of 10. But the eye doesn't do that. If you double the brightness of the light, it will maybe look 20% brighter. We compress these differences. We say we respond logarithmically to the way light comes in. And that gives us tremendous dynamic range, because if I go out in the daytime, I can see perfectly well with sunlight out there. But if I go out in the dark at night with the stars, I can see those too. All with one setting, basically, a very narrow range of settings on my eyeballs. With a camera, you've got to change a lot of stuff. Aperture, you got to change, that's the f-stop, you got to change the exposure time and the ISO setting in order to do that. If you've done any photography trying to do with dim light and bright light, you know what I'm talking about. So they work very differently, and so the camera doesn't respond exactly what you see. And my problem was this part of the sun is far much more brighter than the dark part of the spots than I really realized. And once I realized that, what I did, and this is where the trick comes in, I underexposed them. The proper way to do this is to take such short exposures that the sun is dim and red. When I look at it, when I get on the picture on the camera, I can barely see the sun, it's so dim. But when I download the photos, all this structure you see is preserved. So I send it off to a friend of mine who has Photoshop. I try to remember to do it in raw mode just for him. And then what he will do is he'll restore the brightness, and he'll restore the color and preserve that. He uses Photoshop to do that and preserve that structure. It took me 2 years to figure out how to do that right. So it's one of those amazing things. Now, when I show people sunspots, and we have a program in the summer where I set up a telescope on most days where it's clear and I'm available, and show for about an hour sunspots on the sun, the most common response I get from people is those tiny little things. And I point out to them, compared to the sun, they are pretty tiny. Now I'm going to show you here another sunspot photo that I took, and a guy who did this for me took it on his own, but I'm glad he did. You see this little thing right here? What he did is he photoshopped in the Earth for scale. You could take 109 Earths and put them side by side across the sun's diameter. Are you feeling a wee bit small? So those little bitty things are not little bitty things. They're bigger than the Earth many times. That's amazing, isn't it? And of course, God made the lesser light to rule the night, and he's talking there certainly about the moon. So here's one of my first attempts to photograph the moon. I took a 3.5-inch Questar telescope, attached my digital SLR camera to that, and I was pretty happy with that for a while. But I thought, I can improve upon that. So for Christmas a couple of years ago, I asked my wife to give me a special planetary camera. That's my fourth camera. It's not like a normal camera, though. It's about this big around and about that long. It's like an eyepiece in a telescope. And you plug a wire to it, a cable, and you hook it up to a computer. You see, it doesn't even have a lens. It just has a little detector in there, the photosensitive surface. It's the camera, the telescope is the lens. And you control it with a computer. And you can do a lot of clever things with it. And this is one of the moon pictures I've taken. It's much better than the last one. I think it's sharper, and there's several reasons why it's sharper. I won't go into them now. And I wanted to see, well, how much can I push this? And so I took the left side there, lower left, and I enlarged it and cropped it, and that's the photo. I didn't do anything but enlarging, cropping. And I thought, this is pretty good. But you know what? I can do better. It's going to take time, but I can do better. There are tricks in photography, and I keep learning all these sorts of things. The planets, I like to take photographs of the planets, and here's one I took using the Questar telescope. The problem is the planets are extremely tiny. They're much, much smaller than the moon. So what I've done here is I took a picture of it, but then I cropped it and enlarged it tremendously. And it still looks pretty small. And so you can see on Jupiter there's a dark band, running a couple of dark bands, and I can see a little reddish spot right there. That's the great red spot. Now, it looks a little sharper than that through the telescope, but also with the telescope, I can see four what we call the Galilean satellites. They're natural satellites, or moons, if you will, of Jupiter. 2 of them are about the size of the Earth's moon, but 2 are actually twice the size of the Earth's moon. And I can see those through the telescope. I can see the dark bands and sometimes see the red spot on Jupiter. Looks kind of gray to me because I don't collect enough light to tweak my cones to see that red. But I would see dark little points of light around it. But where are they? With a photograph, I can't see it. Well, again, what happens is the eye and the camera don't respond the same way. If I want to see those, I have to change the exposure, make it a longer exposure, which is what I did here the same night. So you see the 4 Galilean satellites, but what about Jupiter? It's overexposed. If I want to do what the eye sees, I got to take 2 different pictures and maybe cut the Jupiter out here and then put the other picture in it, and that gets close to what I can see with the eye. It's a little sharper what I can see with the eye. Again, the eye is a marvelous thing. We model cameras at them, but the detector is so different. And the eye sees it all, but the camera only can capture one thing or another. It can't capture it all. Ditto for Saturn. Saturn's my favorite thing to look through the telescope. I looked at it through the telescope first time I saw it back in September of 1969. And I was blown away. It's a tiny telescope, it's a tiny image, but man, those rings were as clear as could be. Now, when I use one of our telescopes, a 5-inch refractor at the observatory, we have an observatory at the Creation Museum, I can see also several of its natural satellites. I can see up to 5 on a good night. Where are they? Well, I got to take a longer exposure. You see the rings around Saturn? There's even a shadow of the planet on the ring back here. Well, I took a longer exposure, and now I suddenly see the 5 satellites. Each one's named. I had to look these up. We've got Dione here, Enceladus, Rhea, Tethys, and Titan. I had to look them up because I don't know their positions that well. This is just a background star, by the way. Well, what happened to Saturn? It's overexposed. You can see the oblong shape. That's the rings showing up on that. Well, you may wonder, well, I took these photographs with my digital SLR camera put on the telescope. I was frustrated, so I asked my wife for that planetary camera, remember? And then the next Christmas, I asked for a thing called the PowerMate. And what it does is it extends the focal length of the refracting telescope by a factor of 4. The focal length now is over 2,600 millimeters. Means I've really blown the scale up quite a bit. And so I took a photograph of the moon, of Jupiter. It looks bigger now because it is bigger. I can see a little more detail. I can see the dark bands, and there's the red spot there. Now, if you look through a telescope like this, a really fine, big telescope like this at Jupiter, you'll notice that you can see the bands. You'll see maybe the red spot if it happens to be out. But what will happen is, from time to time, for just an instant, you'll see the planet in really sharp detail, and then it disappears. And a moment later, sharp detail for an instant, and then it kind of disappears. What's going on is we got all this air above us. It's turbulent. Air is rising and falling, different parcels, different temperatures, and it changes the direction that the light moves as it comes in. That's what causes twinkling of stars. Stars don't twinkle, but the atmosphere makes it look like they're doing it. It does the same thing to the planets. It tends to fuzz the images up. That's one reason why we put things like the HST above the Earth's atmosphere to get above that blurring aspect. Now, one of the tricks with that planetary camera is I can, instead of taking one picture of Jupiter like I did here, I can take 1,000 pictures. Literally take 1,000 pictures, each one of them like a tenth of a second. It's going to be underexposed. But what will happen is that occasionally one of those images will be really sharp because it happened to take a photograph when the atmosphere settled down for just an instant. So all I have to do is go through those 1,000 photographs and pick out the 40 or so that are really good. Except I don't have to do that because the computer can do that for me. Wonderful programs they've written. So what I did, and I've only done this a couple of times, I've got to experiment more. Jupiter's coming out in the sky again. I want to go and see if I can improve upon this. But I took about 1,000 pictures, selected 40 or 50 that were good, and then I stacked them. And this is what I got. Same camera, same telescope, same night, except this is doing it a clever way. And you can see a lot of structure now in the red spot. Most images look like that, but you can put it together. I did the same thing for Saturn. And there's the best I've done so far, but there's more to come. I'm still working on it. We got light polluted skies because we're in suburban Cincinnati. I even pointed to the Andromeda Galaxy and said, what can I do with that? And I got that. And that's not bad for a start. This is the Andromeda Galaxy here, the nucleus and the disk. And then there's a little satellite galaxy over here. But some of the amateur astronomer friends of mine, the two I'm talking about, I take a picture like this and I'm really happy with it until I see one of theirs. And then I wonder why I even bother. I'm not going to show you their photos of galaxies, but if you look in the book that Michael was hawking earlier, you'll see some of their work, and it's amazing. I'm only showing you my pictures tonight. Most of the pictures in that book are theirs, not mine. I'm just using some of the ones here. Now, going back to the Questar, I put my digital SLR camera on a total eclipse of the moon. This is like 5 years ago, 4 years ago? Be 5 years ago in January, I think, 2019, I think it was. This is a 13-second exposure, I think around ISO 800. And the center of the shadow of the Earth is down here. That's why it's the darkest. As you work your way out, the edge is farther up beyond, so it's entirely inside the Earth's shadow. But the Earth's shadow, unlike the moon's shadow, the umbra we call it, is not totally dark because you've got an atmosphere around the Earth that bends light into the dark side of the Earth, and it refracts the light and scatters out the blue, leaving the red. That's the reason why you have red sunsets and the sky stays red for a while. So the deepest part of the Earth's shadow is kind of an orange-red shade. It's lighter out to the side. So that's the reason why it changes across. I'm really happy with this photograph, by the way. By the way, they designed the Questar telescope very nicely because when you take a picture in the landscape mode with this, the moon and the sun both, since they're about a half degree, will just almost fill the field of view up. I think they designed the telescope just to do that, so you can get the whole moon or the whole sun in one frame rather than just pieces of it. Now, that's going to be important because that night I was looking at it and I thought the moon, I've looked at the moon many times through the telescope, and I thought the moon looked larger than it normally did. And the moon's orbit is not a circle. It's actually an ellipse. So the moon's distance from the Earth changes by about 14%, from perigee, the closest point, to apogee, the most distant point. Consequently, the moon looks larger when it's near perigee and smaller when it's at apogee. You heard about the supermoon they talked about in the news? That's what they're talking about, a full moon that's near perihelion. I looked it up, and of course this eclipse happens at full moon. It was within a day or so of perigee, so I was really happy with that. So what I did is I waited 9 months. Oh, I'll come back in a second. About a half hour, I took pictures of the partial phases before the eclipse, before the totality and after. And what you're getting there is the moon moving into the Earth's shadow, and so that shadow creeping across it. Now this is a much shorter exposure. It's like 1/400th of a second or so. It's pretty short. And can you see the shape of the Earth's shadow on the moon? This is about a half hour before totality. Here's another one about a half hour after totality. Now can you really see the shape of the Earth's shadow? If you're really, really slow, I'll draw it in for you. And you can see that the Earth's shadow is a circle. It's about 5,000 miles across. The moon's a little over 2,000 miles across. And you may know that, well, all of us grew up hearing what I call the Columbus myth. That is that everybody thought the world was flat except when Columbus 500 years ago showed otherwise. That's pretty much what you heard growing up. It's a big, fat lie. As it turns out, people in the West have known the Earth as a sphere for 2,500 years. 2,000 years before Columbus, they knew the Earth was spherical. How did they figure that out without NASA and all this kind of stuff? It's quite simple. When people ask me, how do I know the Earth is spherical, I stick with two classics. I call them classics because they go all the way back to Aristotle in 350 BC. 2,400 years ago, he was writing about this, and it wasn't news at that point. And what he noted was that the shape of the Earth's shadow during a lunar eclipse is always circular. I've seen 18 total lunar eclipses and a number of other partial lunar eclipses, and I can testify to the fact with more than 20 eclipses, the Earth's shadow on the moon is always a circle. The only shape to consistently cast a circular shadow, regardless of orientation, is a sphere. Ergo, the Earth must be a sphere. How did the Columbus myth get started? It goes back to the 19th century, and there's an evolutionary connection, believe it or not, but I don't have time to talk about that tonight. Remember I said that I looked at when I saw that lunar eclipse and it was near perigee, I looked up on the calendar and I determined when the next full moon would be at apogee. It was 9 months later in September of 2019. So I went out and took another photograph. It's on the right, the photograph of the full moon at perigee and the full moon during eclipse at perigee. Can you see the difference? I have reproduced these at the same scale. Now, you're not going to see that if you try to go out and eyeball it and then 9 months later eyeball it again. Here's a good example I heard recently. It makes perfect sense. If someone laid a 13-inch pizza and a 14-inch pizza on a counter in front of you, could you tell the difference between the two? And I think every one of you could. One of them looks obviously larger. But what if they showed you one pizza and then showed you the other one, say, a day later? You could not tell me which one's larger, if either one's larger. You have to do a side-by-side comparison. This is one thing the camera can do better than the eye. It can keep a permanent record. The best we can do is recall our memory of what we saw, because that image only appears like a tenth of a second at a time. And the moon, as Psalm 89:37 tells us, that is a faithful witness to God's covenant with Israel. And that's a good thing. Sometimes we forget about these things, about some of the purposes they serve. And then we have meteors. Every summer in August, it would have been usually around the 12th, 13th or so of August, the Perseid meteor shower peaks. And I've gone out many times and watched this. My first attempt was about 8 years ago. I just started this astrophotography business, so I set my camera up on the back deck of my light-polluted skies around my house in northern Kentucky. And even the focus wasn't that good, but who cares? I can see some thin clouds in the sky. This little fuzzy patch you see right there, that is the Andromeda Galaxy showing up. And lo and behold, there's a nice meteor photograph going from lower left to upper right. Y'all see that? It changes intensity and it changes color, doesn't it? I started taking pictures with this thing, and as I did, I was doing it for maybe 20 minutes, and then suddenly I saw this bright meteor up in the sky, and I thought, I wonder if I captured that. Well, as it turns out, I went on for a couple more hours. I finally got tired. I was running the camera manually. I had to sit there and manually shoot each one, so I gave up, and I went to bed. But then when I unloaded the pictures and looked at them, sure enough, I'd captured it. That was the only one I captured. I should have quit then. It would have saved me a lot of time. Then, but I looked at it carefully, and there's another little streak there, you see. I didn't see that with my eye because it was too faint, but this is a satellite moving across. You can see those with the eye, but some of them I pick up too faint to be seen with the eye. This is a 13-second exposure as well. A few years ago, during our raft trip, that horrible thing they make me do every summer, it was during the Perseid meteor shower, and I used here a wide-angle lens. And by the way, I got smart. A few years ago, I bought a second camera. That's how the addiction starts, right? And that camera is programmable. So I can sleep while I'm working. I can set this thing up and it will run for about 2.5 hours, almost 3 hours by itself. And then if I wake up in time, I can restart it and also change the battery if it needs to. And I want to come prepared, so now I take with me 20 batteries with me on the raft trip, charged up when I leave, and I have two little Ziploc bags, one that says charged and one that says uncharged, and I move them over from one to the other. But this is during the Perseid meteor. Now, it was taken with a wide-angle lens. It's another thing I got for Christmas one year. I said, buy this for me for Christmas, you know. So I keep getting these astronomy-related things for Christmas, and it's fine, it's fun, and it's work. But here's the Perseid meteor right there. You can see the Milky Way here, the double cluster in Perseus. There's the Andromeda Galaxy. In fact, I sent this picture to one of my amateur astronomer friends and has Photoshop, and he did me one better. He sent me back an identification of each of the galaxies and clusters and nebulae he could identify in it. And I got both photos in my book. You've got one on one page, one on the other to look at them side by side. Here's another photograph of a Perseid meteor shower from the Perseid meteor from the same trip. This is the Milky Way. Got a little bit of moon illumination here on the rocks here. There's the meteor going like this. Now, this is part of a time lapse. Remember, I took a bunch of pictures while I was sleeping, and then I put them together in a time lapse video. And what I want you to do is I want you to watch very carefully. The stars will spin like this, and I want you to watch when you see the meteor. It'll only happen on one frame, so it's going to only be up there for 1/16 of a second 1/16 of a second. And just say now when you see it. Y'all ready? Here it goes. Nope. Y'all saw it, didn't you? If you blink, you'll lose out. By the way, those things streaking back and forth, there's dawn, by the way. Isn't that cool? The things zipping across the sky, those are planes, or some of them might be satellites, but most of them are aircraft flying across. I've gotten pretty good. What I'll do is this most recent raft trip I went on in June, I think I took 7,000 photos, and so not one of them of the rocks in the canyon, and except illuminated at night. And I have a fast technique. I can go through about 1 a second, and I just look for anything that's moving. I stop if I see it on more than one frame, then I know it's a plane or a satellite. But if it's only on one frame, it's almost certainly a meteor. And I have a little file I keep now, and I think I got about 200 meteor photos in it now. I keep collecting those. What I'm going to do with them, I have no idea, but I want reference to them. Here's another one of those time lapses I did, and this one's got a little surprise on it. We'll watch what happens here. It's the Milky Way is moving across, and then the moon is going to rise. So the sky's going to brighten up. See that? The sky's brightening up, and then moonlight begins to creep down the canyon wall. Now there's Jupiter and Saturn there on the left. The brighter one's Jupiter, the fainter one's Saturn. Now I got to tell you here, I quit because it was like 1:30 in the morning. It was the first night. I hadn't slept much the night before, and I was totally gassed. And the problem was I still had the manual camera, which I still use, but this is what prompted me to buy the one I could program. So the one since then, I don't have to worry about going to sleep. I can take care of that. Now, Grandview Camp, I took this photograph a few years ago over Labor Day weekend. You see that bright meteor up there? There's a real nice one there. There's another one right there. I got a twofer. I got 2 meteors in one picture. And over here is Orion. There's his belt, his sword, his knees, his shoulders, his head. Down here is Sirius, Procyon. That is an airplane going through there. This is the Milky Way right here. But do you notice this glow like this, kind of a triangular shaped glow? That is not the Milky Way. That is called the zodiacal light. It's, the sun is well below the horizon, but it's hitting dust particles in the plane of the solar system, the plane of the Earth's orbit, and those dust particles are scattering light, and that's what you're seeing, sunlight going off of those. I thought it'd always be cool to be a scientist who studied the zodiacal light, because you don't have to work for a few hours in the evening or morning and skip the middle of the night. Do y'all know who Brian May is? He was a drummer, I believe, or guitarist, one of the two for what's that?
Astrophysicist, guitar player.
Yes, he played for Queen, and he was in a graduate program in the early 70s, and he was making a lot of progress, but then he started playing more and more with Queen. It became famous, and he had to make a decision. He made a decision to go with music, and he toured, he recorded, all that kind of stuff. Then about 20 years ago, he'd been away from the school for about 25 years, and he went back to them and said, is it possible I could finish my dissertation? And he was studying zodiacal light. And it turns out they determined that nobody had really done anything in those 25 years. So he was able to finish up his PhD. That's really cool. Zodiacal light, nobody studies anymore. And I always wanted a good photograph. Now I got a bunch of them, because you see, this too is part of a time lapse. And I'm going to show you this video. And you'll see the Milky Way rising. You'll kind of see the zodiacal light, but as it gets later and later and it gets more and more of it exposed, it gets brighter and brighter and brighter, and then suddenly dawn happens to wreck it all. So here we go. Watch how it intensifies. And just when it can't get any brighter, it does. Day at dawn. So really an incredible transition. I used my camera to take pictures of Comet Neowise 4 years ago. This was taken at home. I had to walk down the street from my house in my neighborhood, and I circled 2 stars. I took on July 8th of 2020. Here are 2 stars, and there is the comet. You can see the tail going up like that. 5 days later, July 13th, the stars are here, and the tail, the comet is over here. It's moved from here to there. and that's many degrees across the sky. This was taken the exact same time. The stars are a little higher because 5 days later they're going to rise a little earlier. Well, after that, a few days later, it switched from the morning to the evening sky, and I decided to try to make a time lapse of some videos here. I had to zoom it in a little to do this, and that made the scale kind of large. And then I did something incredibly dumb. I should have used my remote, but you're not always thinking clearly when you're doing these things. You're thinking of so many things. So I was doing it manually, and every time I did it, kind of bumped the camera around, so it's kind of jerky. But I also had to change the exposure settings because this is starting in dusk, and if I do it early on, if I make the same setting, it'll be too bright at the beginning and too dark at the end, so I had to keep increasing it as the thing got darker. So it jumps around and it changes intensity, but deal with it. It's the best I could do at the time. There it goes. It's setting. And there it goes. Despite all the flaws, it's not too bad. Here's my first attempt for doing the Milky Way at Grandview Camp. A few years ago I did this. It coincided with a waning gibbous moon, which means it rose about the time the sky got completely dark. So there's a bunch of stuff going on in this. I'll tell you what to look for. You can see the Milky Way over here. You can see Jupiter and Saturn. It's the same year I showed you the two together in June, and now this is September or Labor Day weekend. What's going to happen is it's going to get darker. The sky is going to move like this. It's going to get darker and darker, and then just about the time it gets completely dark, the sky gets bright again, but then moonlight begins to creep down here among the trees, and then one of the workers at the camp getting ready for camp starting the next day, he drives around the truck with a flashlight, and you see the lights going everywhere. So there's a bunch of stuff going on. And again, this was all done with the camera. There's a moonlight, and then there's the moonlight creeping across, and here comes the truck and the guy going around doing his work. So there you go. Oh, and I can't let the solar eclipses go. This first one I took with the Questar again. I had to do an underexposure and then get it brought back up. And I prayed to the Lord. I'd seen some pictures over the years of a partial eclipse of the sun with sunspots, and I said, Lord, can you provide sunspots? And he did. And so just a few days before, I realized we're going to have some sunspots. So here's one of the ones, the partial phase right there, the sunspots showing in, the moon moving in from upper right to lower left. And then we went to totality, and this is the corona. You can see, but you can also see some prominences right here, these blood red loops around the edge. Now, if you take a short exposure, you get the prominences pretty good, but you don't get the corona at all, like if you take like 1/60th of a second. But if you take like a 1 second or 2 second, these are overexposed, the prominences are, and the corona is well exposed. You see these streamers going through it. Of course, I can't get the outer corona because the field of view is too small. And so the neat thing is, if you look at it with your naked eye, you see both at the same time, because remember, we compress those differences. Isn't the eye marvelous? Isn't it wonderful how the Lord made our eye to work the way it does, better than any camera when it comes to it? What I'm telling you is no picture of a total solar eclipse will faithfully show you what it looked like. You have to see it for yourself to understand that. I've been there 3 times, trust me. Say yes if you've seen totality. Yes. A few of you have. Was it the most incredible thing you ever saw? It's the most incredible thing I've ever seen. I'm hungering and thirsting. I'm trying to figure out a way to get to Europe in 2 years, Egypt in 3, and Australia in 4, because I'm really hooked, folks. And you know what people do? They shout and they carry on and carry, you know, all the yelling and screaming and stuff and laughing and things. You know what I do? I shut up. We could charge tickets for that. Danny Faulkner says nothing for 4 minutes. And it's just that I am so absorbed in drinking it all in that I don't think of anything else, because there's so much to see and do, and you can't do it all. It's a wonderful experience. Well, just before totality and just after totality, just for an instant, there's this thing called the diamond ring effect. And I photographed this in 1979 in Manitoba. I did this with a couple of stacked zoom lenses on a 35 millimeter film camera. And I scanned it to show you what we have today. So that streak in there, that's the stuff from the film on the thing. That's not a bad diamond ring, is it? I tried to capture it in, didn't try in 2017. I tried this year and got some success with it. I still like this photo better. The diamond ring is an impressive thing, but you shouldn't look at it. But I did. Don't quote me on that. But 2017, I found out I told everybody look away at the right time, and my wife and my son said they saw it. And I said, "Are you out of your mind?" And then I said, "What did it look like?" I said, "Oh, it was cool." So I hate to say this on a recording, but I did it this time in 2024, and it was cool. And what happened is you will look away very quickly because it's getting bright very quickly. I don't recommend you try this, though, because it is dangerous, I believe. Now, what I'm going to show you, I had two telescopes going, two cameras, two different telescopes. One, the Questar, I had the manually driven ones for 2024. I was near Muncie, Indiana back in April. That's just 4 months ago. And I had the 5-inch refractor with my programmable camera on it. And it was taking a picture every 15 seconds. And I started before the partial phase began, and I went completely through until the partial phase ended. And since it's every 15 seconds, I do 16 frames a second. Every second in this time lapse is 4 minutes of time. I cheated. I duped a Corona picture from the totality 15 times, so there will be 1 second of totality, which corresponds to 4 minutes of totality. You ever understand what I'm saying here? And when you get to just before totality and right after, there will be a brief diamond ring. I put in several frames of that. So you're going to, bam, see that diamond ring for just an instant, then it's gone. And so this actually goes over about 3.5 hours of time on all of this. And it's perfectly centered because I went out, I arrived the night before to my site, and it was raining lightly. And I was really concerned because it was supposed to clear off the next day. I wasn't worried about the eclipse itself, but I was worried about getting a good polar alignment on the telescope so I could drive with it. Otherwise, the sun's going to be moving around, bouncing around like the comet Neowise. I needed a good polar alignment. I went to bed, and I woke up about 4, looked out the window, and I could see a few stars shining through the clouds here and there. So I got up, I went out, set up the 2 tripods, and I leveled them in record time. It was amazing. By that time, the sky had cleared enough to the north I could see Polaris, and I got the polar alignment perfect on these. The Lord is good, isn't he not? Now, one complaint I have with this, I wanted to get a time-lapse video of this. And one complaint I have with this is the fact that you'll see it flicker in brightness. That's because we had thin cirrus clouds rolling through from time to time. And that caused the brightness to vary, but it's a minor imperfection, I think. I'm really happy with it otherwise. So without further ado, here is the eclipse. Kind of jumping because of the, I don't think the, boom. And I don't think the video projector's quite keeping up with, I'm looking at it on my screen on my computer. It's really smooth on my computer, but it's not so smooth on there, but it's really smooth here. And notice the sun's not bouncing around because I had a good polar alignment because the Lord allowed me to do that. I was worried about that. So the Lord could not be any better on this. So I'm getting all these illustrations I can use in my writings. Now, I'm going to take you back to the canyon more recently. This was last year or year before? I think it was the year before. This one is going to have the moon again, but this time I have the programmable camera, so I'm going to go longer this time. So you see the moon, the stars moving across, planes too, satellites too, and then the there comes the Milky Way, and then the moon rises and kind of wrecks everything. Not yet. The sky's going to brighten. There comes the moon. Now watch it creep down the canyon walls. And then dawn. That's moonlight, not sunlight. And there's dawn. Isn't that cool? Here's another one. This is going to show you, it starts off in bright moon, And the star, I'm looking northward now. The stars are spinning around, and then the moon begins to set. As it does, there goes the moonlight zipping away. And then a little later, the sky darkens, and then dawn happens. There's the Milky Way showing up, and then dawn ends the night. Great transition. Well, I've got many more pictures I could show you, but I can't show them all. But I'd like to come back to something. You know, I've shown you some really cool pictures, and you can turn the lights up a little bit in the back now if you want. I think you all agree from your reactions I'm hearing. I think you think this is pretty cool stuff. But you know, it's more than about just some pretty pictures. There's a lot more to it. When I give a talk on creation sometimes, I conclude by telling people, you know, you can agree with everything I said, but if that's as far as it goes, you've missed the entire point. You see, even the devil knows that there's a creator, but it doesn't do him any good, does it? So I like to kind of get to the really important stuff. The fact that the Lord cares about us immensely. The problem is sin entered into the world through disobedience of Adam. We all inherit that sinful nature. And as a result, we have this broken relationship with our Creator. And the penalty for that is death. God expects perfection. You know, back around the time of the eclipse, before the eclipse, where we lived at the museum, we're 99% coverage. And I had some people ask me, well, isn't 99% about as good as 100%? I said, no, no. And I struggled to come up with the best example. And I finally came up with it, the day of the eclipse, I think. And I tried it on Ken Ham, and he just about fell over. He was kind of shocked, but he was amused, but he got it. When he asked me 2 days after the eclipse, he said, isn't 99% about as good as 100%? And I said, no. I said, Ken, is a 99% righteousness as good as 100%? And I pointed out that the rich young ruler was 99% of the way there, but it was no better than 0%, because that one little 1% is what kills the deal, isn't it? Because God's standard is perfection. But you know what? The Lord, in the form of Jesus Christ, God's only Son, stepped out of eternity and into this world, and as a man, he was Emmanuel. He's both man and God, and he knew no sin. He lived a perfectly sinless life. He was a perfect sacrifice, which is what the Passover lamb was all about. Had to be a perfect lamb, and he was crucified at the time. It's beautiful how that works out, isn't it? And he took that penalty of sin for us. And because of just accepting that free substitution gift for us, we can spend eternity with the Lord, folks. That is the entire plan of salvation in just a matter of a few sentences. And I implore you, if you don't know him tonight, if you've not made that decision to accept that free gift, please don't leave. Talk to one of us until you can make that certain. And I see some young people here, a few. And I get tired of seeing people like me with a bunch of white hair. So I like to see young people. And one last word I have for them is the fact that you may have people encouraging you to find out what your calling in life is. I decided as a sophomore in high school. But you know what? At that time, I heard preachers telling all the young people, who said, you need to surrender to your life to His will. And they were always then funneling you towards being a pastor or a missionary or a Christian school teacher or the spouse of one of the three. And that was it. I never heard a pastor say, the Lord needs accountants. The Lord needs officers, police officers and firemen. Never said they need astronomers. Never said they need attorneys. That's pushing the limit, I know. But engineers, all sorts of things. And you know what? Those years at the university, I was at over 26 years at a state university campus, and in retrospect, I was in full-time Christian service there. I was salt and light. I was encouragement to the Christian students we had, along with other faculty and staff who were born-again people too. The campus dean right now, the past 2 campus deans have been born-again people. Really good, wonderful place to work, but also a witness to the world as well. And I work at a full-time Christian ministry, Answers in Genesis. And I'm in full-time Christian service as a scientist, as an astronomer. You know what? We have a DPS program there. We have a bunch of police officers. They're in full-time Christian service. We have people working in the business office, counting, the counting work. Full-time Christian service. They have people that, they call it housekeeping. They're sweeping the floors, they're cleaning the toilets. They're in full-time Christian service. So young people, don't think that you have to be a pastor or missionary. Some of you may be called to do that, and you ought to be open to that. But some of you may be called to be a housekeeper. Who knows what? It's more open than you think it is. And I think I'm trying to restore balance here. There's more than just those three first things I mentioned. Those are fine and good if that's your calling. But if it's not your calling, you better not be doing that, folks. You need to follow what your calling is. Seek that out. Pray to Him. And again, it won't be like you work for a living. Like me, I haven't worked in decades. Well, Michael stole my thunder just a tad bit, but some of you may know Tom Vale. Y'all know who Tom Vale is? He founded Canyon Ministries, the people who run the program with, I get to go on the river every summer. About 20 years ago, he collected pictures of the canyon they'd made, and he had several people write essays, and he published this wonderful picture table book, coffee table book called Grand Canyon: A Different View. Marvelous little book. Well, why did he pick Grand Canyon: A Different View? Well, because for when it comes to geology, that's exhibit A for the evolutionists, talking about that little river down there that took millions of years to carve that out after you had all the millions of years of laying those rock strata. We have a different story to tell, don't we? When you think of biological evolution, what do you think of? It's got to be the Galapagos Islands. Remember the finches that Darwin talked about? They talk about that a lot. Well, a few years ago, Georgia Purdom, biologist there at Answers in Genesis, went on a week-long excursion to Galapagos Islands. They took a bunch of pictures, and we wrote essays all over again, and they've got the Galapagos Islands a different view. I got thinking, wait a minute, I've been collecting pictures from me and two other people. So Tom Vale inspired me, and we came out with The Heavens, A Different View. Came out, I think, 3 years ago, and you just happen to have a few copies here, and I got a silver pen. I can sign those for you if you want. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for listening. And if you want to see some more of my work, you can go on our website, answersingenesis.org. I blog and post things there. I had a blog that went up yesterday. Didn't have any pretty pictures that I took, but I have some I've put up there. If you want to see a lot of my other stuff, though, I do put most of my time-lapse videos on my private YouTube channel. It's a real difficult one to remember. It's one word, Danny Faulkner Stars. They're real easy, and you can see all. I think I have just most of my time-lapse, the better ones. A few of them I haven't put up because they haven't been that good. I put some bad ones up there too, but I've got like 60 or 70 time-lapse videos, and I do some of the sky. I do rivers of fog.